The sea was endless, a mirror of silver stretching beyond sight, and yet it never felt empty to those who sailed it. On calm nights it seemed to breathe like a great living creature, and on stormy ones it roared like a wild beast. For Captain Elias Thorne and the crew of his ship the Starling, the ocean was both a home and a mystery, a place of dangers and dreams where the boundary between waking and sleeping blurred into the lull of waves. Elias had been a sailor since boyhood, raised on the smell of salt and the groan of timbers. His hair was white now, though his shoulders remained strong, and his eyes carried the patience of tides. He did not chase treasure or glory. What drove him was the call of horizons, the promise that beyond each line of sky and water lay another secret waiting to be revealed. He believed the sea whispered to those who listened closely enough, and he had spent a lifetime listening. His crew were bound to him not by coin but by trust and wonder. Lydia the navigator, quiet and sharp-eyed, could read the stars like ink upon parchment and always seemed to know which way the wind would turn. Jonas the carpenter, broad and laughing, carried the soul of a storyteller, and when his hammer was at rest his tongue built tales as carefully as his hands shaped wood. Milo, the youngest, still more boy than man, filled pages of his weather-worn journal with sketches of birds, fish, and the ever-shifting clouds. And Maeve, gentle healer with dark braids and a voice like the hush of rain, tended not only to wounds and fevers but to weary hearts, soothing the crew with whispered songs when the nights grew long. Together they crossed oceans few dared to attempt, and together they carried the memory of each port, each storm, each night spent beneath constellations whose names only Lydia knew. One dawn the sea was painted gold, and Elias stood at the bow with a faded scrap of parchment in his hands. It was a map, or something like a map, handed to him in a faraway harbor by a sailor too old to stand without leaning on his cane. The man had pressed it into Elias's palm and muttered, "The Isle of Echoes. If you have the courage, follow the stars where no compass dares." The parchment showed no coastlines, only a scattering of strange symbols that resembled constellations. Most men would have dismissed it, but Elias felt the same pull he had known since childhood, the ache that had always driven him farther than others. He showed it to Lydia, who studied the faded ink in silence and then whispered, "These stars do not belong to our northern skies. They lie far south, in waters almost no one sails. If this is true, it is a place forgotten by time." Elias had smiled at that, a small, secret smile. Forgotten by time was exactly where he wished to go. The days stretched into weeks as the Starling pushed steadily across the open ocean. The wind sang in the rigging, and at night the deck became a gathering place. Jonas spun stories of ghost ships whose lanterns still glowed beneath the waves, of sea serpents who guarded hidden straits, of cities built of coral where merfolk lit their halls with pearls. Milo, eyes wide, copied each story into his journal, though he never knew how much was truth and how much invention. Lydia sometimes interrupted to correct a star name or a tide current, and Jonas would grin and reply, "A tale without exaggeration is a ship without sails." Maeve's laughter was quiet but warm, and when her voice joined Jonas's stories with soft humming, the sea itself seemed to grow gentler, rocking the ship as if cradling it in sleep. Storms came, as they always did. The sails strained, the mast held, rain lashed like arrows, yet the Starling endured. Elias's voice rose calm and steady above the roar, and the crew clung to their duties with unshaken trust. When the storm broke at last, leaving only foamy trails and torn clouds, they looked to him as if he were carved from the sea itself. And when the winds died and the ocean smoothed, they slept on deck beneath skies swept clean, their dreams deep as the waters beneath. Weeks later they reached a latitude Lydia had never charted. The stars grew unfamiliar, strange southern constellations wheeling across the sky. The air was warmer, heavy with scents of unseen blossoms drifting from far-off islands. The sea turned a deeper shade of blue, almost purple at dusk, and at night it seemed to glow faintly, as though some secret light pulsed in its depths. Whales followed them for days, their voices echoing through the hull in mournful song, and once Milo swore he saw eyes shining up from the waves like lanterns far below. Elias said little, but the map never left his pocket. He felt in his bones that they were drawing nearer to the Isle of Echoes. The first sign came at dawn. A thin white mist lay upon the sea, not of cloud or fog but something stranger, thicker, yet shimmering as if woven with threads of silver. The crew stood in silence, gazing at it. The mist did not drift with the wind, it hung like a wall, waiting. Elias gave the order, and the starlings sailed straight into it. For hours they could see nothing beyond the railing, only pale light and shifting shadows. The world felt muffled, as though sound itself had grown heavy. When at last the mist thinned, an island appeared, rising from the water like a dream. Tall cliffs gleamed pale as bone, and forests of emerald stretched to the shore. Birds wheeled overhead, their calls echoing strangely, doubled and tripled, as though the island itself repeated every sound. They had found it. The Isle of Echoes.
The island seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, as if the cliffs and forests were alive and aware of the visitors drawing near. The crew stood silently on deck, each of them sensing in their own way that they were stepping beyond the boundaries of ordinary seas. Elias gave the order to anchor just offshore, for the waters were shallow and glimmered strangely, the sand beneath shifting with colors like liquid moonlight. A hush lingered over everyone, broken only by the creak of the anchor chain and the distant cry of birds circling high above. When the small rowboat was lowered, Elias went ashore with Lydia, Jonas, Milo, and Maeve. Their oars dipped into water that seemed almost to glow beneath them, and each stroke left ripples of light trailing outward. Milo whispered that it was as if the sea itself wanted to guide them to land, and no one laughed at him. They stepped onto the sand, which was soft and pale, warmer than it should have been at dawn, and every footstep left a faint shimmer that faded slowly, as though the island wished to remember them just a moment longer. The forest beyond the beach was dense but not threatening. The trees grew tall, their leaves wide and glistening, and from the branches hung vines that swayed though there was no wind. Sounds filled the air, chirps, calls, rustles, yet each sound echoed unnaturally, repeating itself softer and softer until it faded like a memory. It was this that gave the island its name, Elias thought, this endless echoing, as though the place were a chamber where voices lingered long after they were spoken. They walked inland together, following a faint path between the trees. Maeve touched the bark of one and murmured that she felt a kind of heartbeat pulsing within. Jonas chuckled nervously, but even he could not deny that the forest seemed alive in ways he had never known. Birds with long tails of silver feathers watched them from branches, and when they called out, the air repeated the call in ghostly chorus. Pools of clear water dotted the ground, each reflecting not the trees above but strange skies, filled with constellations none of them had ever seen. Lydia knelt beside one, staring intently, whispering that the stars it showed did not exist in their own heavens but belonged to another sky entirely. Hours passed, yet the crew did not tire. Time felt different on the island, stretching and bending, so that the sun seemed to hesitate in its climb. At last they reached a clearing where the forest opened to reveal a great stone circle half buried in moss. The stone stood tall, carved with symbols that were neither letters nor pictures, but something between. Elias traced one with his finger and felt the vibration of sound, as though the stone itself were humming. Milo's eyes shone wide with awe as he copied the markings into his journal, determined not to let such wonders be forgotten. That night they camped in the clearing, a fire crackling low while the forest whispered and echoed around them. Jonas told no stories. For once, the storyteller was silent, listening instead. Maeve sang softly, a wordless tune that blended with the strange reverberations of the island until it seemed as if the land itself was singing back. Elias lay awake longer than the others, staring at the stars through the break in the trees. They were wrong, unfamiliar, yet beautiful, constellations he had never charted. He thought of the old sailor who had given him the map, and he wondered if that man had stood in this very place, listening to the same strange echoes. The following day they explored further, climbing the slopes that rose from the center of the island. The higher they went, the clearer the sound of the sea below, carried upward as though the waves themselves were calling. On the summit they found a cavern mouth, dark and vast, its entrance shaped like the jaws of some forgotten beast. A cool breath drifted out, smelling of salt and stone, and when Milo dropped a pebble inside, the echo of it did not stop but carried on, fading into infinity. They lit torches and entered. The cavern walls shimmered faintly as though dusted with crystal, and every footstep multiplied into endless echoes. Deeper they went, until the passage widened into a chamber vast as a cathedral. At its heart stood a pool of water, utterly still, black as night. Above it arched the ceiling, studded with gems that shone like stars, so that it seemed they stood beneath the sky of another world. Elias approached the pool, and in its depths he saw not his own reflection, but shifting images, ships long lost, storms long past, faces of sailors who had sailed before and vanished. The pool was a mirror of memory, a place where the sea kept all it had taken. Maeve whispered that they should leave, but Elias could not pull his eyes away. He saw voyages he had never taken, lands he had never touched, yet he felt as though they were part of him. Lydia gasped quietly, saying she saw constellations she could not name. Jonas gripped his torch tightly, his usual laughter silenced by awe. And Milo, brave in his youth, leaned close and whispered, "It is the voice of the ocean." The pool rippled at his words, though no stone had been thrown. A low sound rose in the chamber, not quite music, not quite speech, but a vibration that sank into their bones. The echoes of the island joined it, repeating, layering, until the air trembled with countless voices. The crew stood frozen, listening. Though none of them could understand the words, they felt their meaning. The sea remembers everything, and those who sail upon it leave traces that never vanish. Every voyage, every song, every sorrow, carried forever in its endless depths. Elias fell to his knees before the pool, overwhelmed. His life, he realized, had been a search for something he could never name, a call he could never silence. Now he understood, it was not discovery he had sought, but connection. The sea had been speaking all along, and here in this hidden chamber, its voice was clear. The sound in the chamber faded slowly, like waves withdrawing from a shore, until at last there was only silence, heavy and sacred. Elias rose with effort, his hands trembling, and looked upon his crew. None of them spoke, for each carried the weight of what they had seen and felt. They knew without words that this island was not a place of maps and compasses, but of memory and echoes, a place where the sea itself revealed its heart. They left the cavern quietly, each step leading them back into daylight as though they were waking from a long dream. Outside, the air was clearer, the sky brighter, and even the wind seemed to carry a softer tone. On the summit they stood together, gazing out across the endless ocean, and Elias whispered, "The sea remembers us now." His words drifted into the air, and the cliffs repeated them, faint and far, as if the island itself agreed. The descent was gentle, and though the forest was unchanged, it felt friendlier, almost welcoming. Birds flew alongside them, their wings scattering glints of light. At the stone circle they paused once more, and Milo touched the markings he had copied. The symbols hummed faintly at his touch, and for a moment the boy thought he heard voices calling his name. Maeve pulled him back gently, smiling with eyes that held both wonder and caution. Back at the shore, the starling waited patiently, its sails folded like wings at rest. The crew pushed the rowboat into the glowing shallows, and as they left the sand, the shimmer of their footprints lingered long after they were gone, fading only when the tide kissed them away. As the anchor was lifted and the sails unfurled, the island receded into mist, slowly vanishing as if it had never been. Yet each of them knew it was no illusion, for their hearts carried the echo still. The sea beyond was calm, stretching like polished glass beneath the light of a pale sun. Days passed, then weeks, and the island did not reappear. Yet none of them spoke of disappointment, for each carried something unseen. Lydia watched the stars at night and felt them whisper to her with new voices. Jonas's stories grew deeper, filled with pauses where silence spoke louder than words. Milo sketched tirelessly, not only what he saw but what he remembered, and sometimes his drawings showed glimpses of things no one else had witnessed. Maeve sang her songs more softly than before, but each note carried a weight that made the crew's dreams peaceful. Elias himself grew quieter. He still guided the ship with steady hands, but at night he stood alone on deck, staring into the horizon as though he might glimpse again the Isle of Echoes. In his silence, however, there was no regret. The map remained in his pocket, though its symbols had grown faint, almost erased, as though the island erased its trail once a seeker had been found worthy. One evening, when the sun dipped into waters of crimson and gold, the crew gathered together as they often did. Jonas, smiling softly, said, "We went seeking an island, but perhaps it was never an island at all. Perhaps it was a mirror, showing us what the sea has always held." Lydia nodded, her gaze on the fading light. Maeve murmured that perhaps they themselves had become echoes now, threads in the song of the ocean. Milo asked what would happen to those echoes when they were gone, and Elias placed a hand on his shoulder, saying, "They will remain, as all things do. The sea forgets nothing." The night that followed was quiet, the water smooth, the sails full with a gentle breeze. Stars blossomed above, unfamiliar constellations weaving themselves among the known ones, and Lydia whispered that perhaps the sky itself had changed since the island. Sleep came easily to all of them, the rhythm of the ship rocking them as tenderly as a cradle. Days became weeks again, the voyage carrying them toward distant harbors and strange horizons. They traded goods at ports, listened to the tales of other sailors, and yet always they returned to the deck at night, their eyes searching the dark water for some glimmer of the island's light. Though they never saw it again, they no longer needed to. The Isle of Echoes lived within them, reshaping the way they heard the sea, the way they dreamed, the way they told their stories. And so the journey continued, not as a quest for treasure or glory, but as a quiet communion. Wherever the Starling sailed, its crew carried with them a fragment of that hidden truth, that the ocean was not only waves and storms and distance, but memory, alive and eternal, cradling every soul who had ever trusted themselves to its embrace. Elias often thought of the old sailor who had given him the map. Perhaps that man, too, had stood in the cavern and listened to the voices. Perhaps all who reached the Isle of Echoes were chosen, called by the same unspoken song. And perhaps, Elias mused as the years lengthened, the true gift of that place was not knowledge but peace, a reminder that no life upon the waters was ever truly lost. Seasons turned while the Starling journeyed across seas that seemed both familiar and newly born. In every harbor, whispers followed them, whispers that the crew carried a strange calm, that storms parted more easily before their sails, that songs sung on their deck drifted farther across the water than any others. Sailors spoke of them as if they belonged not to the present age but to the long memory of the ocean itself, woven into its countless tales. Yet Elias and his crew never boasted, never revealed the truth of what they had seen, for some knowledge was meant to rest quietly like a seashell holding the voice of waves. One night, under a moon swollen and bright as a lantern hung low over the world, Elias awoke from uneasy sleep. A sound had stirred him, faint but unmistakable, the voice of the sea calling through his dreams. He rose and stepped onto the deck, where the horizon shimmered with a light not of sun nor moon, but of something deep and unseen. Lydia soon joined him, her eyes wide with wonder, saying she had been woken by the same call. One by one, the others emerged, as though drawn by invisible threads. None spoke, they only looked toward the glowing horizon. For 3 nights the light lingered, distant yet constant, a beacon or perhaps a memory rising from the waves. At dawn on the 4th day, it was gone, leaving behind only silence. Elias did not order the ship to follow it, though every soul aboard wished he would. Instead, he said softly, "The sea shows us what we are not meant to reach, but only to remember." His words settled like mist upon them, bittersweet and gentle. They sailed on. Storms came, as storms must, but each passed with less fury than before. It was as if the ocean itself respected them now, testing but never punishing, reminding but never harming. In quiet moments, Milo often sketched the cavern pool from memory, filling page after page with faces of sailors long gone, until his journal seemed like a gathering place for the forgotten. Jonas's stories grew less about heroes and battles, more about quiet moments, about lanterns lit against the night, about voices that lingered after the speaker was gone. Maeve's songs, wordless and soft, drifted across the decks until even the timbers of the ship seemed to hum along. Lydia charted stars no one else had ever mapped, her constellations strange and beautiful, guiding them through waters untouched by other ships. Years might have passed, no one could measure them clearly anymore. The voyage was timeless, each day blending into the next, each night carrying echoes of all nights before. The Starling itself seemed to age and yet not weaken, its sails holding firm, its timbers steady. The crew had become part of it, and a part of them, as though the ship itself remembered the island and shared its endless echo. At last they came upon a sea so still it seemed made of glass. No wind stirred, yet the ship moved slowly forward, carried by unseen currents. The sky above was vast and clear, painted with unfamiliar constellations, and the water below reflected them so perfectly that it was impossible to tell where sea ended and sky began. Standing at the bow, Elias felt a deep stillness settle in his chest, not heavy but peaceful, as if the world itself had paused to listen. It was there, upon that mirror sea, that he understood. The Isle of Echoes had never been a destination, nor even a single place. It was a reminder, a doorway, a glimpse into what always was and always would be, the memory of the ocean and the voices of all who trusted it. They had not merely visited it, they had carried it with them ever since, and now they themselves were becoming part of it. Their laughter, their songs, their silence, all drifting into the great chorus that would outlive them. That night, Elias spoke to his crew for the last time about the island. He told them that one day the Starling would no longer sail upon waves of water but upon waves of memory, and when that time came, they must not be afraid. For the sea would hold them gently, as it held all things. His crew listened, not with sorrow but with calm understanding, as if the echoes of the island had already prepared their hearts. The days that followed on the glass-like sea unfolded with a strange quiet beauty. Each sunrise poured gold across the horizon, yet no wind stirred the sails, no waves struck the hull. It was as though the Starling had entered a world between worlds, where time hesitated and space stretched endless in every direction. The crew no longer marked days with their log, for there was no need, each moment blended seamlessly into the next, like the endless ripples of a single tide. Jonas began to tell stories less often, but when he did, his words carried a depth that made the listeners fall silent long after he finished. He no longer spoke of heroes in faraway lands but of the crew themselves, of Lydia charting constellations that glowed only in her mind, of Milo sketching faces of forgotten sailors, of Maeve's voice drifting into the night like a lullaby the ocean cradled, of Elias steering through storms with calm certainty. In telling these stories, Jonas gave them to the sea, as though his words were lanterns set adrift upon dark waters. Maeve, too, felt her songs change. When she sang, the air around her seemed to vibrate softly, and the sea responded with faint ripples though no wind stirred. Sometimes the others awoke in the night to find her at the rail, her face turned to the horizon, humming notes that seemed less her own voice and more the echo of something greater. None disturbed her, for they sensed she was speaking with the sea in its own tongue. Lydia's charts had grown into something beyond navigation. Her parchment was filled not only with stars but with patterns of memory, webs of light that connected places they had seen with places no one else would ever know. She whispered to Elias one evening that she no longer feared being lost, for the sky itself was now her companion, guiding her not just across water but through the fabric of time itself. Elias smiled, and though he said nothing, he understood. As for Milo, the boy had become a young man upon the voyage, his sketches filling countless pages. He often sat alone at the bow, drawing not what lay before him but what stirred within, faces of sailors he had never met, visions of storms he had never sailed, glimpses of shores he would never walk. Yet when he showed his drawings to the others, they recognized them. These were the same memories they had glimpsed in the pool upon the Isle of Echoes. It was as if Milo's hand had become a vessel through which the sea etched its own remembering. Elias watched all this with quiet pride and deeper peace. He no longer felt the old hunger for discovery, the restless urge to chase horizons. The map that had begun their journey lay folded in his chest, its ink faded into near invisibility. He knew now that it had never been meant to lead them to a single place but to open their hearts to the truth that every place, every voyage, every breath upon the sea was part of something eternal. One evening, as the sun sank into the horizon with colors too vast for names, the crew gathered together on deck without calling one another. It was as though an unspoken summons had drawn them all to the same place at the same moment. The sea was utterly still, the sky clear, the world hushed. Elias stood among them and raised his eyes to the stars. He saw constellations both familiar and strange, weaving themselves into patterns that pulsed like living things. Then came a sound, soft, immense, impossible to place. It was not wind, not wave, not bird, not storm. It was the sea itself, speaking in a language without words, a chorus woven of every voice that had ever sailed upon it. The echoes rose around them, countless and eternal, and in those echoes they heard laughter and sorrow, triumph and loss, songs sung long ago, prayers whispered in storms, and silences carried across generations. The crew stood together, listening. They knew then that they were no longer merely sailors but part of the ocean's unending song. Their journey was not ending, nor beginning, but continuing forever, woven into the memory that cradled all who trusted the sea. Elias closed his eyes, and for the first time in his long life, he felt complete stillness within. The call he had chased since his youth had finally resolved into harmony. The Starling drifted on, its sails filled not with wind but with the breath of memory, carrying its crew deeper into the sea of echoes. No map could chart where they were bound, for they had become more than travelers, they had become part of the very story they once sought. And in that story, their voices would live forever, repeating softly through waves and stars, never fading, never lost. And so, the ocean kept them, as it keeps all things, in its endless embrace. The Starling drifted across the mirror-like sea for what felt like an eternity. The air was calm, heavy with silence, and the crew learned to listen not to wind or waves but to the gentle rhythm of their own hearts. Each day began with a sunrise so slow and vast that the world seemed to be breathing. Each night fell under skies so clear that the stars appeared close enough to touch. In that endless quiet, time lost its sharpness, hours, days, and months melted into one long moment, suspended between past and future. Elias often stood at the bow, his hands resting lightly on the wood, feeling the pulse of the ocean beneath. He no longer steered with force or urgency, for he knew the sea carried them where they needed to be. Sometimes, in the stillness, he closed his eyes and felt the presence of those who had come before him, old captains, lost sailors, voices who had once shouted into storms and whispered into the dark. Their echoes filled him with peace rather than sorrow, for he understood now that nothing was ever truly lost. Milo filled page after page of his sketchbook. His drawings grew more dreamlike, blending memory and vision. He would sit for hours, sketching the reflection of stars in the water, only for his hand to add faces in those reflections, faces that smiled gently back at him though he did not know their names. He began to speak less, but when he did, his words carried the weight of dreams. "I think the sea is painting through me," he said one night to Lydia. She looked at his sketches, nodded softly, and replied, "Perhaps you are the sea's memory-given hands." Maeve's voice became a constant companion to the voyage. She no longer sang only for her crew but for the ocean itself. Her melodies floated outward, merging with the silence until it seemed the whole world was humming with her. Sometimes dolphins followed their ship, rising gracefully from the water as if to listen. Sometimes gulls circled silently, as though keeping watch. And once, in the deepest night, strange glowing fish gathered beneath the ship, their bodies illuminating the sea with a soft blue light, swaying gently to her song as if the ocean itself had opened a window to watch. Jonas, the storyteller, had changed most of all. His tales no longer belonged only to human ears. He told stories to the sea, leaning over the rail at night, speaking softly as if confiding in an old friend. His words were gentle, rhythmic, and unhurried, like prayers. Sometimes the others heard him murmuring names none of them recognized. Perhaps they were sailors from long ago, or perhaps they were names he had never known until the sea gave them to him. Lydia's charts, once filled with stars and coordinates, now resembled great webs of light. She mapped not just constellations but threads of memory, lines connecting sky to sea, sea to heart, heart to echo. She confessed to Elias that when she traced those maps with her fingers, she sometimes felt she could hear voices humming softly through the parchment. Elias told her not to fear. "The sea has chosen you to listen," he said. "Not all are given such a gift." The crew no longer worried about destinations or harbors. They no longer measured supplies with anxiety, for the sea seemed to provide. Rain fell gently when water was needed, fish gathered when food grew scarce, fruits appeared on drifting isles when they longed for land. It was as if the ocean itself had become their guardian, carrying them not only across distance but through the heart of its mysteries. One evening, a mist rose upon the horizon. It was faint at first, a soft veil in the distance, but it thickened as they sailed. The crew stood together in silence as the ship entered its embrace. The mist glowed faintly with its own light, shimmering like pearls. Within its depths, shadows moved, not frightening shadows, but gentle forms, drifting like memories. Elias felt a chill of recognition. They were sailing into another threshold, another place where the ocean revealed its secrets. Milo whispered, "It's like the island again." Elias nodded, though his eyes were heavy with thought. "Not the same place," he murmured. "But the same truth." The ship sailed deeper into the mist. The water below began to glow, the light shifting and changing as if thousands of lanterns floated just beneath the surface. The crew leaned over the rails, eyes wide, and saw faces forming in the glow, smiling, calm, patient. Some were old, some young, some familiar, some unknown. All of them radiated peace. The sea was showing them again what it had shown in the cavern pool, that every soul who had ever trusted the waters lived on within it. The voices rose softly, a chorus not of words but of feeling, a lullaby as ancient as the tide. The crew stood together in awe, their hearts swelling with quiet understanding. They were not alone, had never been alone, and never would be. The ocean carried them, remembered them, and one day, would welcome them fully into its embrace. The mist closed around them, wrapping the starling like a blanket. And for the first time every soul aboard, Elias, Lydia, Milo, Maeve, Jonas, felt not as travelers upon the sea, but as part of it. The mist lingered for days, or perhaps it was only hours, no one could tell any more. The crew of the Starling lived in a dreamlike calm, where each breath felt part of something greater than themselves. The ship drifted as if guided by unseen hands, and though no stars could be seen through the silvery veil, Lydia's charts glowed faintly in her cabin, as though the very mist etched its own constellations upon her paper. One evening, Milo stood at the bow with his sketchbook resting on the rail. His hands moved without pause, drawing lines and faces he could not name. Maeve approached him quietly, listening to the faint scratching of his pencil. "What do you see tonight?" she asked. Milo did not look up. "Not what I see," he whispered, "but what sees me. The sea is remembering through me again." He turned the page toward her, and Maeve gasped. The sketch showed their entire crew, but not as they stood in that moment. Instead, each of them appeared older, or younger, or different, as if the drawing contained not one version of them but many lives they might have lived. Maeve touched the page gently, her voice hushed. "We are part of something endless." Milo only nodded, his eyes heavy with wonder. Jonas had grown quieter, but one night, as the crew sat together on the deck with lanterns glowing dimly through the mist, he began to speak again. His story was not told with the bold flourish of a performer but with the steady cadence of someone remembering. He spoke of a ship that sailed across time itself, carrying voices instead of cargo, and how those voices would someday merge with the ocean, becoming waves and winds and stars. As he spoke, the crew felt the truth settle into their bones. They were hearing not just Jonas's story, but the ocean's story told through him. The mist shifted one night, parting slightly to reveal waters that shimmered with light. Tiny sparks glowed beneath the surface, drifting upward like fireflies. Lydia leaned over the rail, eyes wide. Plankton, she breathed, though even as she said it, she knew it was more than that. The glowing drift was alive with patterns, spirals, circles, constellations that echoed her maps. She hurried to her cabin and returned with parchment, sketching the shapes as they appeared beneath the water. Yet each time she set ink to page, the patterns changed, as though the sea were playing with her, teaching her that no map could ever capture its full truth. Elias watched all of this with quiet peace. He had lived long upon the ocean, had once thought of it as something to conquer, to chart, to master. But now he knew it was not mastery that mattered, but surrender, the trust to let the sea carry them where it willed. He stood at the wheel, not steering but simply resting his hands upon it, listening to the timbers of the ship as though it, too, had joined their circle of voices. One night, the mist thinned enough for the stars to appear again. But these were not the familiar constellations of their homeland, they were vast, strange, and beautiful, spread across the heavens in shapes no sailor had ever charted. The crew gathered silently, gazing upward. Lydia traced the patterns with her hand. "It feels," she whispered, "as if we've sailed beyond the world we once knew." And perhaps they had. For in that moment, all of them felt a deep stillness, a sense that they had crossed into a place outside of time, a realm where the sea no longer ended and the sky no longer began. Milo put down his sketchbook, Maeve ceased her singing, Jonas let silence cradle his words, and Lydia lowered her maps. Together they stood with Elias, staring into the infinite night. The sea beneath them hummed softly, like a great heartbeat, steady and eternal. The ship drifted forward, and in the silence, each of them felt a presence, warm, vast, embracing. It was not the call of adventure nor the thrill of discovery, but something gentler, the sense of coming home. They did not speak of it, for there were no words to describe such a feeling. Instead, they let the silence stretch long into the night, until sleep overtook them one by one. And as they dreamed, they heard faint echoes, not of strangers, but of their own voices, already woven into the ocean's song. Dawn arrived without warning, soft and weightless, as though the world itself had exhaled. The mist thinned, and the starling drifted into a sea of glass so pure it reflected sky and water as one. For a moment, no one could tell where the ocean ended and the heavens began. The crew stirred quietly, each of them rising from sleep as though called by the same unseen voice. Elias stood at the bow. His hair, touched with silver by years of sun and salt, lifted gently in the faint breeze. He had no map in his hand, no compass, no need for stars. His gaze was steady, not fixed upon a destination, but upon the horizon itself, the eternal line that had once taunted him with its distance, now welcoming him with open arms. For the first time, he did not feel the hunger to chase it. He felt, instead, that it was coming to meet him. Lydia brought her final chart to the deck. Unlike all the others, this one had no lines, no coordinates, no constellations. It was simply blank parchment, glowing faintly in the morning light. She smiled as she set it upon the wood. "It doesn't need me anymore," she said softly. "The map has already been written, in us." Elias touched her shoulder and nodded, saying nothing, for her words needed no answer. Milo carried his sketchbook, but the pages inside were now filled. Every inch was covered in drawings, faces, seas, stars, echoes of voices that would never fade. He held it to his chest like a treasure, though he no longer opened it. "I think this belongs to the ocean now," he murmured. He set it gently upon the deck, and the sea breeze lifted the pages until they fluttered like wings. Then the book stilled, resting as though it had always been part of the ship. Maeve stood at the rail, her voice quiet but steady as she began to sing. It was not a song of longing or loss, but of rest. The melody wound through the air like sunlight on calm water, rising and falling with the breath of the world. The sea responded, glowing faintly beneath the ship, ripples spreading outward in gentle harmony. Her song was no longer her own, it belonged to the sea, and the sea sang back through her. Jonas, the old storyteller, cleared his throat, though his eyes were bright with peace. Once, he began, there was a crew who sailed into the heart of the ocean. They sought islands and stars, treasures and truths. And though they found many wonders, what they discovered at last was not a place, but a home. Not a treasure, but a song. Not an ending, but a beginning that will never fade. His voice trembled, but no one minded. For they all knew this was his final story, and it was theirs, too. The starling drifted on, carried by no wind and no wave, but by something greater, the quiet embrace of the sea itself. The horizon shimmered, glowing with a light softer than dawn, warmer than sunset. The crew stood together, side by side, saying nothing, for nothing was left to say. They had become part of the ocean's memory, their voices woven into its eternal song. As the ship passed into the glowing horizon, the world seemed to sigh, and all was still. The sea held them gently, the stars folded above them, and time itself faded into calm. And if you listen closely, on nights when the waves are quiet, when the stars shimmer on the surface of the sea, you can still hear them. A captain's steady voice. A boy's gentle sketches. A mapmaker's whisper. A singer's lullaby. A storyteller's echo. The ocean remembers. The ocean keeps. The ocean sings. And the starling sails on forever.